Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Circling Dialogos and my conversation with Isabela Granic. More about this conversation and about Isabela and who she is and what we talk about in a moment. But first, some housekeeping. If you are interested in circling, the best way to check it out is to go to the website. All relevant links to circling are below in the show notes. Specifically, we have drop-in events on Thursday nights that are open to everybody. We have weekend events that are open to everybody, and one of the main offerings is the Art of Circling, which it starts in November, and it's filling up pretty quickly, quicker than normal. So if you've been thinking about doing it, and you just haven't gotten around to checking it out or registering for it, you probably want to jump on that as quick as you can. Also, if you're interested in working with me one-on-one, go ahead and email me at guysengstock@gmail.com and just let me know, and I'll get back with you, and we'll go over it. Okay. So, Isabela, sorry. I believe I met Isabela at first in the Circling and Dialogos workshop that I do with John Vervaeke, Chris, and Corinna, and she, I believe, came on and did a circling course, which I got to know her a little bit more, and then through knowing her, I started to get a sense of who she was and what her work was about, and I had to have her on the channel for a conversation. There's so many points of convergence. Isabela she's a developmental psychologist. She's been a university professor, tenured professor, sorry, and also has research labs. And she talks about at a certain point, it dawned on her that what she could provide as a professor no longer in that form could actually give her students what they needed in terms of learning. And so she left her job as a professor to really focus on something that she's calling liminal learning. And it's a project that she's starting that is, I believe it's inspired by the Bildung schools in Europe. And so we get into that and the philosophy of that and her work and where she comes from, and she is an amazing person, and this conversation goes really, really deep, and we ended up going to some pretty interesting topics that I wouldn't have necessarily anticipated that were quite profound. We talk about listening. I go deep into listening and intersubjectivity and all the things that are going on in there, and how that links to her own history and how she came to this work, and the journey of all of that. So this is clearly going to be just the first conversation with her. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I certainly did. All right. Enjoy. So welcome, Isabela.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'm super excited to have this conversation, as I've been looking at your work and listening to some of the other podcasts that you've been on, and reading the website of the project that you're involved in and spearheading, right, and co-creating, and getting a sense of the kind of the experiential and philosophical ground that's being covered, right, in what you're doing. There's just so many similarities there. I was struck by it, actually. There's some kind of mysterious sweet spot, right, between, I'd say something, it's like something about like the like, for lack of a better word, like Socratic inquiry and ineffable experience, right, coming together and learning. That kind of inexhaustible coming together of that seems to be what your attention is drawn to, which I can really relate to a lot. And then I know that you've also are a developmental psychologist, right? You've started and run your own labs and research. You were a tenured professor, and I also understand what I gathered from reading about you that you actually left your tenure because you realized that something's going on in the world, right? With young people, where you realize your position, you couldn't be, as you wrote, useful to them anymore,
Like,
and that
yeah.
you turned and you left to turn your attention to address that in some sense, which
Mhm.
I was struck by that, and I think this is where I kind of want to start off is what I've been curious about with you, and I think I've sensed this from the first time talking with you, is I sense that there is a way that the world is speaking to you, calling to you, addressing itself to you, right? That
Mhm.
that I kind of get the sense there's something, you sense something urgent.
Yeah. So the urgency is definitely there, and it always has been. And I think that it's interesting that you got that part. Yeah, just backing up a little bit, I think that I have left my position and tenure and so on. I still keep my foot in the science world by being part of McMaster University so that I can get science grants and I can get funding for the projects we want, but I am not ensconced in the institution or need to put my energy into administration or leadership in that context, which is just drained me of intention and impact and so on, right? I still, what I really loved and missed to some degree is the teaching aspect and the connection with young people. And so that's partially why I wanted to make sure to build that into anything that I do in the future. And so, yeah, the urgency is exactly that. It feels, and I don't, maybe it's a stage of life too. I mean, I did the relatively conventional thing of going to graduate school and getting my PhD and getting assistant prof and so on, and went up the ladder and got successful grants and that sort of thing. And then you get to a point where you're like, okay, I've literally made it in terms of all these indices of success, and there's a sort of questioning period of, is this all it is, and if it isn't, what else is missing? And
Hmm.
because I was very tied into, I was also chair of my department for 8 years and so on, so it's very easy for that urgency to feel like you're doing important things, and my days were filled and I had people around me telling me that I was doing the right job. So I think that the opportunity, or the I had just a moment of hitting a wall, and it wasn't burnout. It wasn't this feeling of like, this is too much. It was just a crisis of meaning. And it was tied, I think, I have two 17-year-old boys, twin boys. And they were turning, I guess, 14. And there was just a, what the hell is this all about kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, and the world getting thrown into the pandemic shortly afterwards, helped to kind of
Mm.
provide a context for some important reflection that had to be done.
Yeah.
And so I realized a lot of the things that I had checked off had to do with, recognition and status,
Yeah.
and everything that I was kind of focused on. And a lot of impact was not being sort of actualized in the way that I wanted it to be. So
Yeah.
yeah. And it's really, I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience where I'm incredibly surprised by the things that have come back to me from like adolescence. So the love of philosophy, poetry, literature,
Yeah.
connection with other people, the feeling that things don't feel quite real unless they're shared, beauty doesn't feel quite real unless it's shared. All of these sort of elements kind of came together
Yeah.
uh, for me. And so now mostly what I focus on is trying to build this liminal learning thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
which, which is exactly what you say. It's an opportunity to It's a learning and development program, very much like resonant with the Bildung, sort of, do you know the Bildung Nordic
Yeah.
approach to
Yeah.
personal development, character development, and so on.
Yeah.
And but this to me is something that I feel urgently is needed in a way that it's funny that you say urgency. I think the program I'm trying to develop with others, and it's a very we kind of thing, but it's just bringing together, is really about getting young people at around 18 to 24 years old. They've been coerced the hell out of
Yeah.
education systems and
Yeah.
parenting systems oftentimes as well. And they're entering this like, what are they going to do? Similar to mine, actually.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of young people right now very much want to create some kind of purpose in their life, even if it's small p, just something that means something, right?
Yeah.
So this program is meant to give them an opportunity to go on retreats with other like-minded kids,
Yeah.
and to find in this time, in this week-long period of time, a way to both conceptually inquire about what they want based on history and philosophy and applied psychology, so this conceptual realm, and then at the same time have them be involved daily in practices, collective practices that are very resonant. And this is why I've been taking circling training and so on.
Yeah.
Circling like, authentic, relating like, all
Yeah.
deal like practices that help them ground what they're learning conceptually into practice and figure out for themselves what works and what doesn't, what's useful in their lives and what doesn't. So that's a bit of a
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So I want to dive deeper into that. First, I want to go back a little bit. So, and I would say, just to reflect back to you, the urgency that I sense, I think where it comes out is what I notice it's in it's in the way things seem to catch your interest, right? There's a certain almost fierceness, right? Interest in the world, right? Like, and I just sense that there's some urgency you're responding to, but it seems to come out in your way of being interested, your way of leading in, right?
I like that. Thank you for
Yeah.
noticing.
Yeah, that's how it struck me. But like if we go back, there was a point, if we go back in time, right? There was a point probably where there was no Isabel, right? Isabel wasn't even a thought. And then a few things happened, right? And a whole process happened, and then you yourself were born.
Yes.
And in that moment, you inherited a whole world. What was that like? What did you, what were you born into, and what did you inherit?
So I was born in Romania,
Ooh.
and yeah, to a Russian-born father and a Romanian mother, and both of them single children. And so I was born right, so 1970. So it was Ceausescu's still, he had another good 10, 15 years to go, more than that, actually. What am I talking about? And so after I was 4, my parents fled Romania, and we immigrated to Canada. So that actually has a big impact on me for obvious reasons of any immigrant experience, but also because Canada has a lovely way of allowing people to keep their own sort of culture as they integrate with Canadian culture. And so my parents, immersed me in mostly Romanian friends, and they would have parties, and they had a very particular Latin based, loud arguments and lots of emotion all over the place and so on. So that has a lot of impact on me.
Yeah.
And then also my father moved us to Florida, Palm Beach Gardens, when I was 12. So my formative years were 12 to 18. We're in a very different world.
Huh.
Never Romania, but just going from Toronto to Florida, which was a huge shock, because prior to that, my brother and I were deeply immersed with friends that were from every culture, every race, everything. And then we were brought, kind of dumped into a public school system that was the best I can say is just deeply racist. And both of us were sort of like, what is going on? And they were using words we would never use. And my brother took it a much harder, and he was a much more sensitive person. And I learned how to be a complete chameleon. So people were saying racist things, and I'd be like, la, 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 la. And I never fit into any group, but I was liked by all, but never, I was always the misfit on the outside. So
Yeah.
I was a geek, did good classes, took, whatever. My best friend was a bully, but she was a cheerleader. So I hung around her for the popularity. I had the alternative music thing and tried to wear a little too much black makeup and so on. So I had all these little cliques that I would fall into and out of. And I think that is also a really, I've just been reflecting lately on this, is that there's this sense of loneliness. Despite me being married for 27 years, having two incredible boys, feeling very connected emotionally to them, to my mother, to my brother, and so on. There's a sense of loneliness because I don't think I ever really felt like I fit into any context. And I've met other people, and when you meet them, you're like, you, I know you.
Yeah.
And I think that's partially why I'm so interested in building opportunities for young people to find their squad early enough,
Yeah.
where they, and not based on these external labels, but things that kind of feel internally driven.
Yeah, totally. That makes sense.
Yeah, and I've never told the story. I haven't been on podcasts that actually asked me about my childhood or anything like that. So
Yeah.
it's interesting but that is definitely the I've met other people, and now I've met a group of people that I can tell you a little bit about, because it's been a pretty influential experience. But finding other people who have that same sense of loneliness and outsider, and then feel this deep emotional connection when we find each other, has really made me believe in this model for liminal learning for other people to have it,
Right. The picture that it's interesting because it's also, I would imagine, when you talked about your family fled Romania, like, and I would imagine that had to be done in secretive, and because you're escaping basically communism. Like, one, I could imagine to do that, I could just imagine the kind of various intensities your parents must have to be able to do something like that. And like what impact having to having where you were born in your home be the thing that was most compromising to you, such that you had to flee it, right? Let alone what it is just to move to a new country that you don't have to flee, but having to flee and move. Just, I sense an intensity in what I would imagine to be is an intensity in your parents.
Yes, they were intense parents. My father passed away almost 5 years ago now, or 5 years exactly, actually. And both of them had a sort of clarity of vision around they do what they do for their children. And that can be a great blessing, and it can also be a great burden for the kids, of course.
Yeah.
But there was a sense of adventure in them, and many other Romanians their age, they actually had this crazy golden period where Ceausescu was not the deep asshole, or at least wasn't activating all the really terrible things until a bit later. Even it got a lot worse when after we left. But so there was this period where there was enough badness, and there had to be some sneakiness, and they snuck over like rock and roll music and pantyhose and all of these kind of things, but they still had the joy of connection with each other and of culture, and having a shared kind of enemy. And many of their friends, almost all of them from high school, left with them, and whether it was to Toronto or other places around the world. So there was something about the collective kind of young people saying it was their form of the 70s or the 60s revolution, right? But and so I think what could have been a very traumatic and terrible thing felt more to them like adventure and
Interesting.
And they imparted that on us, right? So there was my brother and I felt like, yeah, we had to live up to
Yeah.
this venture that they took on our behalf. But they were also like, you need to like find purpose, and you need to make a impact on the world, because we didn't do this for nothing, kind of thing, which
Yeah.
does something to you.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's some urgency.
Yeah.
So there's you said there's a positive, there's a, we're all about you.
Mhm.
We're all doing this for you, right? Which on one level there's a kind of obvious positiveness about that, but also a burden.
Yeah.
And it sounds like part of the burden was making sure that you found your purpose, that you had a purpose, that you got out there, like
Yeah.
in a sense that was a kind of a must or a pressure of some kind. Is that how you experienced it, or how was it?
Absolutely. So the good part is also that we were deeply loved. Like, there was no doubt how much we were loved and admired and cherished, and there's all that good attachment stuff that was there for sure.
Yeah.
And it was primary, especially for my mother. My father was just the typical, of that age. He provided for us. He told us that's his expression of love. He eventually became also much more like mushy and whatever. But so that was there. What was difficult, and I'm only now sort of exploring in myself, is the extent to which that purpose was constrained. So, like a lot of immigrant, especially Eastern Europeans, math, science, you're going to be a doctor, lawyer, journalist, some of those career paths. And this is when everybody it's way more extreme now, but to imagine expressing oneself through, I would come home and dance, or I'd write poetry, or want to be a writer for the longest time, and I was writing and writing and writing, and that was not encouraged. And bless them, I understand why, but it was, so that kind of self-expression
Yeah.
was very much constrained, and it was for either frivolous reasons that you can engage in that, or otherwise, they were extremely scared that I would flake out, or that my brother would flake out and do something like get into whatever, a band or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's the part that is really that, that I'm reflecting now on how much of myself wanted to express herself creatively and didn't get a chance to do that. And so now I'm like doing crazy, like air or whatever, watercolors, and suddenly starting to write differently. All that kind of.
So it sounds like they were like the make something of yourself, finding your purpose was viewed more from the left side of the brain for them. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Which was like science and kind of traditional kind of certainties and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I went into undergrad as an economics and psychology major. And then I was like, I cannot be with the idea that I was going to go into business, whatever that was. And I just couldn't deal with it. And I immediately went into English literature and wanted to drop even psychology and just stay in English literature. And that was not going to happen. So psychology was like my best bet, sort of. I can still get into human nature and social connection and learn more about that while not being an artist or anything like that.
There's a compromise there. I'm curious, what is it that at that time, if you bring yourself back there, what was it about literature that called you so much to it? What you see in that?
Yeah, that's easy. I mean, to me, I still think that if I had known that I would end up in academia, I might have ended up just staying in literature, because research in that realm, I would have been almost the same, and I would have been teaching. And it's because it's the best for me context in which to explore human nature and relationships and emotional experiences in a very experiential way. So you are involved in it. You experience the lives of these other characters. I'm talking about very good writers. I'm not talking about just and poetry in a different way allows for that experiential sense of the here and now, and sharing a like our sense of humanity in a way that's very the rhythms of the language and the sounds of it kind of entrains us with not only the poet but with others who might be listening to a recitation and so on. So there's something very primal around poetry and what you got from that. And literature, some of my favorite writers are those who just wrote real lives in ways that we lived them. And so I very much was a book girl very early on.
Yeah.
And then when I discovered Virginia Woolf or Tolstoy or, these people who were able to still, you could read them still right now and completely empathize with these people and understand yourself through the lens of these people in a way that I don't think most psychology textbooks would never give you that same sense of connection to humanity.
Yeah, it's like, it's true. It strikes me. It's like when you're talking about poetry, like to really read poetry is really it's a participatory sport, right? It's like it's something, it's an experience you undergo.
Yes.
Totally. Do you recall at the time, like, what, when you first, when literature really started to speak with you, who were some of the early poets that really spoke to you, and authors? Do you recall?
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, those are mostly the ones that still call to me. So the kind of classics would be people like Emily Dickinson, Rilke, of course, Goethe. I mean, there was different elements that, had playful, I still like writers like Billy Collins who just would play with language and get you to laugh a little bit longer. I could actually, like, my brain goes a bit fuzzy, which is going to be terrible. I mean, Lorca and Neruda, those are the people that were like the ones that got me into, I was and still am a deeply romantic, sentimental, very into bittersweet. Leonard Cohen is still my favorite person that I listen to, right? So reading Neruda or reading Lorca and just being in these realms of deep, passionate love and all of that, it was always my thing.
Right. So that it's the way that these authors and their medium brought you close to what was most human in us.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And the impulse to share that.
Yeah.
There's something about poetry that expresses, because it's like this crystalline, it's not language in the way that we usually use language. So, we use it to express so much that is almost embodied. It's again, the rhythm, the sound of the words, and the way that it's a spell. It's like a spell that kind of pulls us together, and the rereading of them. So many people just read a poem, they read it once and that's it. I was like, wait, what are you doing? Where are you going off with that poem? But the rereading of it is always uncovers and always sort of it's this kind of uncovering. Aletheia is one of the Greek words for it. This uncovering of meaning for the person personally, and then there's this sharing of it. It's like somebody else saw this, right? This is incredible that they were able to pierce me with their own sort of intuition, right? So
I sense eros.
Yes, exactly.
Right, deeply. Right. So it sounds like what in literature, it sounds like it's the eros. It sounds like a very a sense of, as John would say, it's like erotic. The eros is like, makes you want to consume and be consumed by this kind of inexhaustible, receding horizon, deepening your desire, perpetuating itself,
absolutely,
to just dissolve into it, right? But could never quite get it. That's
it. So that what you're expressing is this longing that I very much, Goethe has a great poem called The Holy Longing. And it's this feeling of, the fact that that there is something else out there that you can't really share with, it starts with, tell it to a wise man, I'll forget it right now unless I read the whole thing. But the point is, don't tell it to anybody because you'll be mocked.
Yeah.
Tell it to people who will be able to receive it because it is so precious and that it is really out there. And the fact that you long for it it's by that virtue that is indicates that there is something more out there, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing as the love dogs of Rumi is the same thing. Is the very fact that we moan or the dog moans for his owner or something like that signifies that there's some kind of bond. There is something more than
Yeah.
just in front of us.
I can
Yes.
feel, it's funny and there was a certain moment when I asked you about who were some of the poets and writers, and you kind of stopped and you looked out. I kind of sensed this, I imagined
Mm-hmm.
you looking at this like the horizons of horizons somehow, right?
Yeah.
And then what you just kind of unfold in the way that you're talking about it, it's such a good job presencing it, is like what I, and it's also what I sense actually is articulating it itself in your work, which we'll go into more, if not this conversation at another point, but like this way that what seems to it's maybe what we mean when we say like shows us or we get close to whatever it is makes us human, has this
Mm-hmm.
quality of this this awareness of some inexhaustible horizons of horizon, right? That like by definition is it inexhaustible. It's always we can never grasp it and like say anything final of it, but yet we can't help but constantly yearn for it. Yet the only way that we really know it is by knowing that we don't know all of it, right?
Yeah, that's it. And I think what's really interesting about poetry and also, other good literature, and you could also call things like some music, it is that the sharing of that brings us a sense of awe and shared awe, which opens even more. It's like this pushing of boundaries as we share that. And so often I get this experience where I'm reading a poem and sometimes also a novel or something like that, where it's like it's almost painful because I can't share it. I'm alone, and it's like, and I remember that feeling as well as a teenager, where it's like there's no one right here to share this with, and so there is something that also connects very deeply with that yearning to be with others in that experience. And to some degree, it's filled by the poem because you have this poet who is speaking, but then you want to, and it's like going out and seeing a beautiful, or going to a restaurant and having a great meal. And you're just like, I wish somebody's here to just feel it with me,
Yeah, totally. That's what, kind of, I'm glad that you brought that back to what you were experiencing when you moved to Florida. It sounds especially because what you described it sounds like a very astute, adaptive way of dealing with what you put yourself into, which is, but I got the sense of, oh yeah, somehow by like not abiding in what everyone believed, but participating in a way such that they saw you as somebody that they liked. I kind of got this picture of something, in some way, something deeply you being beside yourself in all of that, right? So like all the conversations they would talk to this one that you could show,
Yes.
but wasn't talking to all of you, and in the deep aloneness that you were talking about, that kind of in some senses a through line. That's like, even as what I heard you say is like, even though I have this deep attachment experience with your family of origin, right, and your marriage and your kids, that there is this thread that's, it sounds like what I'm hearing is that lately you've been reflecting on it and realizing this thread, which I think is just interesting. And I can relate to that a lot. Is like, it's funny as we get older, as I get older, I have more insights, right, about myself. Those insights come with a rediscovering my past. I get a new past with an insight, which I think is just
striking. Just
That's a beautiful way of saying it. That I mean, the scientific, maybe more ways, like suddenly these activity patterns that were inaccessible, you're feeling something, and now suddenly they are lighting up new, because of course memories aren't just stored in some box that you open up. It's like they're lit up by something that we feel right now, and that's and it's very astute what you just said from just those very few words of describing around the high school experience, because the thing that I feel similarly to right now, having left academia and was very much a part of that clique or world or did that thing, and now I'm kind of going into the circling world, and I do this like other authentic relating. I'm about to go to the Stoa tonight, and each one of these I'm like, which one are going to actually accept, or how am I going to feel in terms of like walking in and being my whole self, right? And so this is part of the longing, is being received by others as your whole self. And that's probably still part of my longing. That's probably still what I'm hoping to provide my kids that I didn't have. And so I'm building this liminal learning why, probably for them, so that they could find that space. And build more of those spaces out in the world. And again, this is where it circles back to circling, that I think these kinds of practices that help us listen, and in that listening hear ourselves, not just the other person, is so necessary, so important, enlivening.
So interesting. Just like as we're talking about it, I'm just getting this, I feel awake to, with you, through you, just that insatiable ache, desire, right? That like, in some sense, is like so paradoxical, right? Because on some level, it's desiring something that can't ever be completely. So the image that's kind of coming to my mind is it's like the Sistine Chapel of the two fingers, right? Like it's like in the, it's called, the movie about Michelangelo, right? The book is called The Agony of the Ecstasy. It's like there's a way that them not touching is deeply agonist, and there's something about them not touching is deeply ecstatic. Like they're so. And if those fingers touch, no one would ever even notice that thing.
Right.
It's that they don't touch that seems. I've often thought, like, in some way, like if you look deep in the human heart, you'll see right at the center of those two fingers.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. That's a beautiful image to ground or to extend this, because the other side, that so there's these artful way. I think artists are often trying to express in different ways this longing, right, for whatever it is, that connection to the sublime or to the sacred or but also to each other. And so there's that angle, and then there's like a very, for me, unappreciated or less discussed scientific, like developmental science. So we are born in this absolutely intersubjective space. It is all about, you're coming out of an actual body. You are connected, literally, physically. And then, even as the umbilical cord is snipped, the entire orientation of the baby is towards the mother, eventually also with the father. And there is this deep, like there are beautiful, developmental scientists and neuroscientists like Alan Shore and Trevarthen and a bunch of others that have talked about this kind of dance and this attunement that you get between infant and mother. And there's a very good reason why the father is like, hello, because there is this deep oneness that, and I'm at the other side of it, by the way, right? I'm ready to get these kids after a year to go off into that world. So I'm very aware of this process of, birthing kids to get more and more separate from us. But I think the fact that we start there, and then there's this, growing into autonomy, that's natural and all good, but still hard, right? And there's still that, and I just wonder if there has to be something about that kind of initial intersubjectivity that we're always still searching for, that initial feeling that we didn't have words. It wasn't put in linguistics or even stories. They were just first emotions and feeling states and arousal states that were held in this kind of intersubjective state.
I'm loving all the gestures you're using seem telling to what you're talking about. This, oh yeah, like letting them go. Like there's something mutual,
Yeah,
reciprocating in that. And
absolutely.
I just loved what you said. I got to plug this back in. The and it's also what I heard you emphasize in the poetry and the literature, right? There's this, on one level, there's this yearning, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then there's this then sharing it that makes it somehow more real, right? And is intricately part of it, this kind of sharing it. And when then you talked about this way that we're born, like all of us are born, and of course, you know, biologically, I can't think of anything more helpless and dependent than a human infant by far.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're the most helpless and dependent. We can kind of suck, but we don't know quite where, and we can sometimes poop. Everything else is about this coming together. And of course, I have a 23-month-old, so I'm re-experiencing this. But this way that you describe, that we literally kind of come to ourselves in and through these deep relations, that is what's most primordial to us, right? Are these deep relations that by the time we have, our brain has the ability to recursively fold back on itself, that which it folds back on is given by these relations.
Yes, right? Exactly. Yeah. And this idea, I mean, people rail against, and for good reason, around the capitalist system about toxic individuality. And, we can talk about it as in it's deeply selfish or self-absorbed and it's not satisfying. But there's also something just wrong about imagining that the most natural unit, if you will, is the individual, right? It's all good to be able to express yourself and to have space and to be able to hear yourself and reflect by yourself. But the idea that baseline is supposed to be alone, and if you're doing well, you're doing okay if you can actually be alone, I think is a bit nuts, Yeah. There's some really great research also on social baseline theory. Do you know at all Cohn's work? So he's great because he did this research on, he's a social neuroscientist, and he did this research looking at people in the fMRI and looked at their brains in 3 conditions. They were either alone and they had a stressful, I can't remember the stimuli, was it some kind of blast maybe of sound, but they went through a stressful or hurtful context where they were either alone or they were holding the hand of a stranger or they were holding a hand of their lover or what a partner, marital partner. And what you saw, and to some degree, it was counter to the first hypothesis, is that the brain lit up absolutely the most when they were alone and the least when they were holding their romantic partner. And the idea is that we are at baseline. Our social baseline is what is rest, is what is dealing with all the stressors better, more efficiently, more in a more like relaxed, attentive, sensitive way. Whereas alone, you're in high stress the whole time, even before the zap, right? So you can imagine we're walking around, not in a baseline chill way. We have to meditate. We have to do all these things to feel okay alone. And I think that also has huge implications. And when we think about some of the circling practices of just being comfortable with another person sitting down or looking in each other's eyes and so on, we have to work towards that because we've been separated so long and for so many sort of practices at school, at home, and told to be on our, I just think it's really phenomenal that we forget those sort of biological needs to be close to one another and to be understood and seen by each other.
Thank God for some of the, I mean, like the attachment literature and the
Yeah.
studies and stuff that just revealing the biology of this, right? This these bonds that we are so, they're so prior to and presuppose what we call individuality, right? In fact, I heard of another study recently, which made a lot of sense. Oh, of course, they have to start the lawnmower, right? If that keeps going, I may have to move. But where they did this study where they put people in different lengths, time periods of isolation, and they noticed that when they would go back with the people, to the degree that, like, the length of time that they were isolated is to matched up one-to-one relationship with how little that they could answer about what they thought, right? Like where their life was going, who they were, what they wanted. Like the more they were isolated, the less they could answer those questions, right? And it's this one-to-one relationship, right? Which I really think, and I think you point to this in your in some of the things that you wrote and on the website for your projects, kind of highlighting this need for learning in this deeper participatory way, right? And you pointed to, like, one of the things that you're responding to is this, and I think you even start off in the paper that you wrote with, we are living in a time analogous to the printing press, right? For alphabetic writing, these big shifts in communication, which of course, if you shift communication, you shift everything, right? And you name our technological epoch, if you will, a fundamental shift, right? And it excludes so much of the way that we learn, the way we've learned historically, what we're responding to. And my sense with this is that, and I don't hear this talked about a lot, but it seems to me that once emailing and texting and a lot of the social media and all the iterations of that, before that, if you had to exchange information with somebody, you had to at least talk on the phone, right? You always had to, if there was an information exchange that was two-way, it was always coupled with relationship, right? And now all of a sudden, we have all these ways where we can exchange information, right? We've uncoupled it from relationship. And because relationship is inherently messy and chaotic, like you could say something to me, right, that I mishear that changes my whole conception of myself, right? Like,
or me.
The way that relations are deeply normative, but there's also there's always a snake in the garden, right? And so our nervous system will just do what it always does, which is go towards what's easiest.
Yes. And what I think is really, so there's a couple of things I wanted to pick up on what you just said. So first of all, it's really easy to lump technology as everything.
I'm going to pause this really quick. I need to pause. Okay. Hang on. Resume. Right.
All right. Yeah. So I was thinking about what you said around technology. And I think what's one of the things that I've been thinking a lot. So in my academic research, most of it is on technology, designing for and with young people with technology for mental health. So all sorts of ways of using games and apps that they design with us so that these are approaches that can teach them how to flourish, regulate their emotions. And there's ways of using technology that actually amplifies our connection and our sense of groundedness in using these technologies. I can give you a bunch of examples, but one of the most recent ones now, it just reminded me of the thing you said about the telephone, because one of the things we're trying to develop are these audio experiences where we design prompts and sort of different types of constraints in the way that you can share the audio experiences. And so, for example, there is one that we are developing around active listening. And so you are asked on a sort of audio app, it could be something like Telegram, you're asked to, you're paired up with a partner and you're asked to answer the question, what is home to you? And you leave an audio message to the person who might be doing it about what is home to you. And then they are asked to rephrase what you've said and ask some just clarifying questions. And the other person listens and you go back and forth and then you ask deepening questions and so on, right?
Yeah.
But it's with voice. It's not with text. It's not with visual. It's not with video. It's not even like this.
Yeah.
And something about voice has this intimacy about it that we connect with in a really different way. There's another study that they showed kids who were in undergrad who got the same reassuring message from their parent when they were stressed out, either in text format or in audio format. And in the text format, it had no impact on their cortisol levels, their stress hormones. When they got the audio one, though, same exact message in terms of content, their cortisol levels went down, their physiology regulated. So there's something about sound that's so primary, that does something to us. And so, this is to the larger question of, I think it's not that technology is all evil. I'm sure, we're here talking in this way, so I know you agree. But in the very Ian McGilchrist way, we have designed it entirely for mostly capitalist aims and, profit and so on, and not for connection and not for, all sorts of things that we could use it for. And I think there's so much promise out there right now. And again, with liminal learning, I feel like those young people themselves could be designing these experiences in a way that they demand more from their technology than the ways that our first iterations of them did. So I think there's so much promise there.
Totally. Yeah. There's a way that technology can be in service of something that doesn't just enslave us in more technology. Right. Yeah. Exactly. That's Heidegger kind of makes that distinction of where he's like, I'm not against technology or even talking about technological devices. I'm talking about the technological hijacking of our understanding of being as a resource, right? As a standing reserve.
Yes.
That attitude. We can actually use technology that kind of, in some sense, is not governed by that attitude, right?
So that's the ready at hand versus present at hand distinction, where he distinguishes things like, when we're using a hammer and we forget that it's a tool and it's just a part of us, similar to our phones, for example, and then we don't question the obviousness of it.
Yeah,
and that questioning that I think this next generation is actually really ready for. I hear these kids, they talk about the fact that they have to take TikTok off their phones. I hear them reflecting about their lack of connection or their lack of motivation that gets sapped by this stuff. And so I don't think they're beyond reflecting about the impact and doing something about it. A lot of parents, I feel, have just given up and thought, these kids are just so addicted that we can't do anything about it. And I'm like, I don't think so. They're ready for something different.
Yeah. Going back, I was struck by what you said about there's something about hearing, right? And the voice that has this dramatically different impact on us versus just reading a text that and even I think what I heard you say, even like taking away the visual, there's something more intimate, and there's something that just feels really true about that.
Yes.
It's the voice, hearing another's voice, listening. What do you think it is about sound? Is it language, hearing that seems to afford this kind of sense of intimacy in the ways that the other senses or capacities that are the senses?
I suspect there's a lot of science that I don't know about, and I've been meaning to. It's a big thing on my list, but I think that one of the things you just mentioned is exactly what I think distinguishes it. And it also distinguishes what poetry does, is that I think it goes beyond language. So we're stuck in this left hemisphere type of logical reasoning, and language does this thing where we're attending to the conceptual world at that conceptual level.
Yeah.
And when we hear a voice, the tone matters. I mean, how many of us talk about this, the vacuous nature of texting, and you don't know whether somebody's being sarcastic or loving or whatever it is, right? And like there's so much that we communicate with the voice that is beyond language, and in fact gets to us, I think, in a more efficient, quick, heartfelt, literally way. And I think it's exactly that. It goes beyond language, or it doesn't require the constraints of this left hemisphere language processing, and we get this other thing that we are so desperate for.
Yeah, it's a tune,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's
exactly.
along with whatever the message is that's being said. It's like it does this attuning thing that's just so native for us, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm fascinated with, I'm struck by whatever it is that we call listening, right? This,
Why?
I'm struck by what that is, right? And there's something really mysterious about that just seems so crucially important to what it is to be human, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and it has something to do at a very basic level with attention and how we attend, and probably, survival over millennia had probably a lot to do with the deep attuning of our hearing and our listening for certain elements and disregarding other elements. Like if you ever see somebody who has to start using hearing aids, you get how much listening is much more than just hearing, right? Because you're attending, and you have to have your brain kind of shuts down other things in the background to attend to what you intend to attend to, right? And so I think there's something about, again, this is a McGilchrist thing around attention being a moral act, but there is a way that we attend to others and how they attend to us that feels like we're organizing or co-constructing meaning in a like deeply important way, right?
Yeah, and really in a deep sense, because it's also there's this kind of interesting looking at the relationship between listening and thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Like we can, if right now as I'm talking and something kind of catches your attention, you start thinking, right? You'll be thinking, and then all of a sudden you'll realize, like, when you bring yourself back, you're like, oh, I haven't been listening this whole time because I've been thinking. So there's something very closely wedded to whatever it is that thinks, to whatever it is that listens in some sense.
Absolutely, which is why we think we can do these parallel processing, doing a bunch of things at the same time. And in fact, we're not. We're doing everything poorer because of our attention is being divided in a way that doesn't work. I mean, it can work for menial tasks, of course, but again, if it's like we're trying to have a conversation and something else is on our mind, how often do we have that where we notice that somebody's gone,
Totally. So it's kind of like when I give my ear to you, right, and I truly listen to you,
mm-hmm.
in some sense, I'm kind of giving over my thinking to you, right? And in some way, I'm allowing you to think me in some way. That's really quite intimate when you think about it, right?
Yes, and I love that way of thinking about it because it calls to mind what the hell is collective intelligence, and we can talk about that in bajillions of ways, right? But I love this idea. So it's also really interesting that it connects back to that social baseline thing. The other thing that they find is that if you're with somebody, well, you actually said it, that you can think more clearly. Or it's hard to think through a problem or whatever it is if you're alone, right? And the opposite is true too. So for example, they give people backpacks and they say to estimate the weight of the backpack, or whether or not they're going to be able to go up a slope or not, and how steep the slope is. And people will rate the slope as less steep and the backpack as less heavy when they just have a person next to them. Nobody's holding it for them. It's just that the feeling of cognitive resources or resources in general are shared. And so there's a sense of everything being lighter, and there's literally physically, they're really cool studies. And so now think about what we're doing right now. And it's very different giving a monologue talk in front of people versus this discussion where I feel like you're holding some of this weight. And if I don't get that same word, maybe you'll remember it for me. And that's something emergent, and that's something lighter
Yeah,
and more creative, more flexible, probably, because we're doing this attuned listening as well as thinking together, right?
totally, totally. And there's that, yeah, yeah, and there's that way. Yeah, when I'm really listening, there's a way that and on one level, I'm always already, in some of the predictive processing work, there's kind of this sense of like I'm already anticipating that there's something you're sharing. So I'm already like, but prior to your speech, there's something extending over into you, right? And that like in some sense, I hear you when when my prediction falls short, it kind of breaks some frame, and that's a way that something really kind of comes in. It's this way where it's like it's kind. I can get a sense of more of the intimacy of listening, right? Of versus where with seeing, which I think most of our metaphors about knowledge and knowing and all that kind of stuff have to do with is mostly visual. I mean, we're super visual, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Especially with the technology kind of stuff. And visual, there's the visual sense, like well, one, you can fill visual space, right?
Mm-hmm.
Finite, right? Which acoustical space, it seems like you can go as loud. There's no degree. There's something inexhaustible about acoustical space that seems different than visual space. And then visual space, it seems like I only always see the surface of things, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Therefore, I can like from a visual perspective, I have to, in some sense, analyze what's underneath, which is where with hearing, like the sound discloses like the structure, the internal structure and integrity of the table, right? There's an interior,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's interesting and also evolutionary. I think, how on, the thing that distinguishes us, right? From lizards and so on is, one of the big things is this cooperative social action, for obvious reasons. And so this big, evolutionary aha was this social coordination. And how do you do it? It's not with seeing each other here. It's being able to speak to each other across or communicate. Maybe that we weren't even using language for a while, but we had to communicate across large distances, right? So I imagine there's an acuity that has to be developed. I mean, I'm totally speaking out of my realm of having read, but I do imagine that there's something about hearing that was very essential to cooperative behavior, arising to begin with.
Yeah, yeah, totally, totally. And this kind of way, right? So this is also what I kind of hear in what you're doing, right? With the learning project, the adult learning project that you're coming together. One of the things I read over and over and over again in what you're doing is the use of the word mentorship, right? Apprenticeship, right? Um, there was one line that I remember for a young person to experience what it's like to be held in high regard, right, by an older person, right? And it's interesting because I didn't hear the word teach
Mm.
often or teacher. And I wanted to I think that there's something about listening, something about everything that we're talking about seems to hearken to the same sensibility of what you're feeling called to bring to young adults, right? That seems to be really, really missing in the words. What is the distinction between a teacher? And most of the time when people think of learning, they think of a teacher standing in front of the room, right? You in a row listening, kind of a monologue and memorizing stuff, right? But then there's apprenticeship, right? There's mentoring, right? There's all those kinds of words.
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between, like, say, a teacher, right, and learning via like a mentorship? An apprentice.
So I love that you picked that up. and it's intentional. And definitely the words apprenticeship and mentorship are intentional. So, but the fact that I didn't put in teacher is really interesting. So the part that I don't often talk about when I talk about liminal learning is when I think about the program, I don't think about the liminal learning, the learners. Liminal, as you know, is this in-between phase transitioning kind of place. And we can be there at the place where we're going to start with this program, which is in these gap years of 18 to 24 with young people. But I think that the cross-generational nature of the program, the important element is that I think we as the older adults are going to be learners as well, and need to be. The part of the modeling that we do is to listen well, and is to be present to the things that we learn from young people so that we can stay relevant, not because for them, for ourselves, because the way we die off and become, depressed and anxious is to lose meaning in our own lives. And the way we stop being cognitively flexible and so on is to not be useful anymore. And so the idea of bringing together the older generations, those who are like transitioning out of maybe their main career trajectory and so on, and want to do more service, is that we are learning as much as these young people are learning. And there's a co-mentorship going on. And so I think of mentorship really that there is, of course, more experience. And really this is grounded in experience. There's the conceptual stuff, but the older person has just gone through shitloads more in life. And so what we are mentoring is more around how to critically think, how to collaborate, how to listen well, how to empathize. So there's content that will focus on in terms of thematics, themes for each week. But really what we're doing is modeling and experiencing with them the learning together. And so I think mentorship is really about asking very good questions of the young people, and then trying to help them search for their own places for those answers. And then the apprenticeship part was meant to really appeal to, the times, Middle Ages before that and after that, for that matter, where there were hands-on apprenticeship that had to do with immediate feedback and confidence building, but based on stuff that's being done, not pumping up people because you can do it and the world is out here and everyone is special and has their gifts, but literally you tried this thing, it didn't work, and here, let me show you the reasons why, now you try it. And so apprenticeship is this quick iterations on action, on behavior. And I think over a span of a week, no matter what you learn, whether it's podcasting or design thinking or woodworking or whatever it is, that experience with somebody showing you very quickly and watching your own learning curve, I think can give people a taste for how fun and how deeply rewarding learning is. And so those are the mentorship and apprenticeship elements are really intentional there.
Yeah, it's funny you talking about like we both like student mentor, like, and you just kept doing these circles with your hands, right?
Yes.
Was educational in itself. I appreciated that a lot. And that sense of, there's a sense of like these close feedback groups of iterating, right? Adjusting, iterating, and being kind of this feedback. I sense there's something deeply going on about mimicking.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right. Which
Absolutely.
is watching Teague he's mimicking things at such a deep level that he actually doesn't officially, like, he keeps having so he'll hear something,
Mm-hmm.
and then 3 weeks later, out of nowhere, he'll start saying it, right? And I'm like, there's some what is going on with that? There's some kind of deep conforming happening, right? It's like, prior to conceptual level, right?
It's definitely unconscious. I mean, you see this mimicry in like, different gestures or different, ways of saying words but it's not just, I mean, they are deeply attuned to that flexibility, like flexibly adjusting to their world. They're deeply attuned to what we kind of notice and what we don't notice. And they keep iterating on those things, never mind all the explicit teaching or modeling that we do for them. But also adults, like we forget that, and part of what I wanted to say around how important attachment is, it is, but what to me gives me so much hope and energy is that we can also repair deeply damaged relationships and relationships to self. And so we are still flexible, and we continue to be flexible as adults. And when you get into these incredible experiences that you're held by a group and you're encouraged and you become better at something in the eyes of other people as well, that can be very powerful to heal a lot of that coercive type of experiences that we have. And we mimic as adults all the time. You and I, when we do our hands, we do this. If you have a drink and another person, I used to do this all the time, just to get me through boring Zoom calls. I would take a drink and then I would watch how many people would mimic. And this is completely unconscious. Everybody would take a drink. It's just the weirdest, interesting thing.
That's really interesting. So there's that sense of so with mentorship, apprenticeship, there's this sense of a kind of a dwelling in something together, right? Where my grandfather became a tailor in 1915 or something in Hanover, Germany. Escaped his 17 brothers and sisters on the farm and snuck into Hanover and apprenticed as a tailor.
Mm-hmm.
Because he would talk about, I got this sense when he would tell stories about that period of time that, of course, there were times where they explicitly were talking about tailoring, right? And he lived at the shop, right? He dwelled there. There was times they were explicitly being taught things, but then there was also this way that there was something happening that when they weren't talking about tailoring, that was going on in the background that they both dwelled in, that there was something really deep about a deep education through that relationship with the relationship with his mentor, but also what they were inside of, right? That is right is deep. There's a deep intimacy, and so when he would talk about those times, there was a different tone, different to how he would tell those stories that seemed to.
My grandfather was also a tailor, and it's exactly that kind of thing where he would talk about his buddies in the shop or the kids that he would apprentice with him, and he would also show me like the pelts. He was a furrier actually, so it wasn't quite the tailor. He was a furrier, but tailor also, but of furs. And the way he talked about it was just, he lit up in the same way, but it was all about the relational thing, and I think that's really interesting, that what happens in that container.
Yeah. And then what you just talked about, which I really appreciated, right? We could have a whole nother conversation about this, but, it's one of the few things where, you could say when a relationship goes bad, and if it goes really bad, right, that can fuck us up more than anything, right? Like when we experience malevolence coming towards us or like a betrayal. I mean, these things will kind of just undo us, right? And therapists across the world for eons, but it's one of the few things where a relationship can, in some sense, wound me. That a different way of relating, but relationship can be the very thing that resolves that very wound, right? It's one of those. A relationship is one of those areas where, the poison is also the medicine, right? Mm-hmm. And I really appreciated that, right? Because I see that over and over and over again in work, because I've worked a lot with families and couples and, done in my circling work, and just seeing how the way that you relate, right, is perhaps the only thing that will touch the damage of the way that they related before, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And having that, these different, I think we also just put way too much emphasis on our romantic partner being everything, both, the saving of all our old wounds and so on. And so the experience of having either good friends or other people that can hold you in these, that's also just healing one by one, these relationships where people can see through the first layer and can not only accept but celebrate parts of you and share other parts, I think that's also just really, potentially great experiences for people. Yeah.
Totally. Well, unfortunately, I need to start to bring this to a completion. But we have a lot more to talk about.
I'd love that.
This was been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate getting to know you more and hearing.
Thank you for your attention and your wonderful questions. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah. Let's do more of this. I'll be in touch, and then I'll just put all some of the links that you gave me on the thing below if people want to look at your.
Thank you. That's great. That'd be great. Thank you. Really enjoy your time down in Florida.
I will. Bye.